right now we have Anna Strasser here to give her talk. And so from here, Anna, please take it away.
So, thanks a lot for the invitation to this interesting conference. I'm talking about the topic in between tools and social agents. I added a subtitle. It's on the status of large language models in human-machine interaction. So I'm only interested in large language models if we are interacting with them and not asking questions whether machines could actually individually act without me. I start with the question of whether we can make friends with artificial systems that simply consist of software, algorithm, and data. I assume you would find it quite unsettling if a friend or your child would claim that for them, interaction with software, say a deep neural network that is enabled by a self-attention mechanism and a huge amount of training data to respond to prompts with linguistic output, would be the most meaningful and important social interactions they have. Observing the emotionally charged debate about the status and abilities of large language models and other artificial systems, we see that we are already confronted with the idea of making friends with artificial systems. Just think of the statements from replica users who felt like losing their best friends after an update of replica that made sexual conversations impossible. Or remember Blake Lemoine, statements in which he truly claimed that Lambda has consciousness and sentience, and even lost his job for saying this. And already in 2018, a Japanese named Akihito Kondo married his beloved waifu, which is just a hologram of a virtual singer named Hatsuno Miko. And I checked, they are still together. With the hype around large language models, everyone seems to have a very strong opinion about the capacities of large language models, what they can do, cannot do, may one day do, and what they will never be able to do. Strong opinion seems to be a general feature of statements about the future of AI, as my brother illustrated it in the graphic novel that I created together with him for my anthology. There are a lot of controversial debates going on. My observation is that many terms that have so far been used in philosophy to describe the distinguishing features of humans as rational agents now find themselves in a situation where their application to machine is at least being discussed. On this slide, you see a selection of papers discussing notions like knowledge, understanding, or systematic generalization. And on the right side, you see again a picture from the graphic novel illustrating the opinions of some other scientists. And maybe you recognize some of them. I don't know. I think I don't need to give you a more detailed overview of the landscape of opinions about large language models. On this slide, you just see on the left side Bender's stochastic parrots idea, Gary Marcus, who is not getting tired of pointing out that we are still a long way away from AGI, and on the right side, you see Sam Altman, who seems to be preparing for AGI. Thinking about the status of large language models or other hybrid artificial systems based on generative AI could or should have, I ask, what are we doing when we interact with large language models? I start with the strong and maybe provocative claim that we cannot reduce all interactions with large language models, and especially not with future products of generative AI, to mere tool use. When I ask myself whether a large language model or a robot developed with generative AI technology is a person or a thing, an agent or a tool, I would answer neither nor, but unfortunately I have no philosophical terminology with which I could describe what it is instead. Therefore, I'm highly motivated to rethink our conceptual frameworks, which so clearly distinguish between tools as inanimate things and humans as social, rational, and everything, if everything goes well, even moral interaction partners. Or, as Eric and I formulated in a recent paper, it's not quite right to say that our interactions with large language models are properly asocial, and at the same time, it's not quite right to say that our interactions with large language models are properly social. This means neither reducing the status of large language models to mere tools, with which we may play or somehow enjoy a strange way of talking to ourselves, nor assuming that we are, in some sense, acting jointly with a genuine social collaborator can do justice to what is happening if we interact with large language models. I suggest categorizing those interactions as in-between phenomena, for which neither ordinary concepts and unfortunately also not standard philosophical theorizing have prepared us well to think about. This is a terra incognita, as so far standard conceptions of sociality account only for living beings, not for artificial systems. In principle, I do see 4 strategies, but there are probably more than 4, and how we may reach the goal to conceptualize the in-between. The first strategy would be we could expand the notion of tools and add something like complex tools with social features to this category. Or we could expand the notion of social agents and add some non-living social agents to this category. Or we could just invent a new category and call them somehow. But I shall argue that it is best to find a way through the terra incognita by questioning the dichotomy between living and non-living beings, animate and inanimate, and adopting a gradualist approach through which we can conceptualize a multi-dimensional spectrum. Let me explain why I do not favor the other 3 options. Of course, by expanding the notion of tools, we can emphasize the differences between humans and machines and claim that large language models are functionally, for example, neurobiologically or cognitively, absolutely dissimilar to intelligent sentient human beings in their causal genesis. However, at the same time, we are not in a very good position to argue for potential multiple realization of social cognitive capacities that are normally only ascribed to living beings. That's why I don't like number 1. Expanding the notion of social agents is not that attractive either, because we may then wrongly overemphasize the similarities between humans and machines and end up following people like Lemore, who claimed that in an immediate interaction, large language model seems functionally, in this case conversationally, similar to an intelligent sentient human being. Finally, the problem of conceptualization with respect to the in-between does not disappear if we introduce a 3rd category. On the contrary, it becomes even more complicated, because if we establish a conceptual framework that contains 3 categories, then we will have at least 2 in-betweens we can't conceptualize. But I think I need to give you more motivations why to follow me on the fourth strategy. That's why I invite you to join me in exploring the jungle of the terra incognita, the in-between, by exploring what I'm doing. Now, I will present diverse considerations that motivated me to advocate such a radical approach to conceptualize the in-between. I start with the general claim that many conditions posed by philosophy are too demanding. They describe ideal cases that are rarely found in everyday life. Not only the abilities of artificial systems, but also the abilities of children and non-human animals tend to fall through the conceptual net of sophisticated philosophy. And that's why I believe that we need a more gradual approach. If we agree that the sophisticated terminology of philosophy prevents us from grasping the in-between, we are motivated to explore conceptual frameworks that can distinguish more finely grained instances across a wider spectrum to capture phenomena which we find in developmental psychology, animal cognition, and, as I claim, in artificial intelligence. To this end, it seems natural to elaborate on less demanding conditions by discussing notions such as quasi-social versus fully social, minimal agency versus full-fledged agency, and asymmetrical quasi-social joint actions versus full-fledged joint actions and stuff like that. But I don't think that this is enough. I think we need to prepare ourselves to challenge the widespread dichotomy between the animate and the inanimate. Thinking about the in-between, I have the impression that an essential factor why its conceptualization is so complicated is that our thinking is guided by many dichotomies, such as animate, inanimate, natural, artificial, organic, inorganic, or person-thing. Based on all these dichotomies, we have not only developed terms that are used to capture, for example, animateness. But at the same time, this animateness is additionally considered as a necessary condition for the attribution of all kinds of social cognitive abilities. In what follows, I will outline various motivations for questioning the dichotomy in this way. First, I suggest that those binary distinctions can be understood as artificially constructed dichotomies that are the result of certain cultural traditions. According to the Western conception, it's still the prevailing view to think that only humans, non-human animals, and maybe plants can be regarded as something what we would call living entities. However, taking into account cultural diversity, we see that non-Western cultures, for example, in Shintoism or animism, characterize entities as animate objects that are considered inanimate from a Western perspective. So I think we should at least acknowledge that our Western conception is just one conception of many. Second, there are now right of nature's movements that are fighting for natural entities, from lakes to mountains, to be recognized in law by giving them legal personhood that includes the right to be protected, to be free of pollution, and to sue. This might also challenge the widespread assumption that only living beings, like humans or non-human animals, who are able to suffer, can be ascribed ethical values. Such legal steps, which are happening in our world already, are able to link Western and indigenous worldviews. And last but not least, I think there's an interesting fact about our notion of social agents. One can show that attitudes towards the status of social agents have proven mutable throughout human history. For example, as far as the status of women, children, and other ethnic groups and some non-human animals is concerned, the class of social agency has already been extended in various ways. From our contemporary perspective, it seems unimaginable that any human should be excluded from being considered a social agent. But a view in our very recent history shows that, for example, slaves and even women were not regarded as social agents in certain respects. So this all shows that the notions can be changed, or at least to whom we apply the notions. Coming back to human-machine interactions, one can observe that artificial systems are used in the experimental designs of social neuroscience. There are studies investigating interaction with avatars as a way of understanding human-human interactions, not tool use of humans. Those studies assume that human-machine interactions are comparable to interactions among humans. And if those interactions with the artificial systems would not have any similarities with human interactions, they could not be used to explore the human behavior, what the neuroscience people do. One could argue that for centuries and ages, this dichotomous distinction between the living and the non-living has worked quite well. But maybe we should ask ourselves whether we are perhaps now confronted with a new game, and then we might have reason to change formerly winning team. Pointing to the ethical implications of this dichotomy, I might have the chance to convince you at least to give it a try to see what is happening if we're questioning this dichotomy. What worries me here is that if we keep this dichotomy and explore the ethical status of artificial systems, we can only choose between two extreme positions. And I think both have consequences that we would rather avoid. In other words, as long as our considerations are based on a dichotomy between living and non-living entities, we only have two options. And I label those two options as the hardcore instrumental view and the in expectation of AGI view. Hardcore instrumentalists put all artificial systems in the box of non-living things that can neither have moral agency nor moral patiency. They claim that non-living entities can only play the role of mere tools in interactions with humans because they can neither act nor experience or feel anything. Following them, we would come to the conclusion that all artificial systems, regardless of how much AI technology is used to create them, should be considered mere tools that lack any agentive, cognitive, affective capacities. According to the other extreme position, which I call the in-expectation of AGI view, one would search for arguments that make it appropriate to consider certain artificial systems as moral patients or even as moral agents, treating artificial systems as if they would belong to the category of living beings. Ultimately, such positions would then amount to the assertion of artificial life. I labeled approaches that go in this direction in expectation of AGI view, even though I would even put protagonists which are not really thinking that AGI is that near. So there is sort of a graded spectrum of people I locate there. So now I will sketch some of the consequences I see in each of the two extreme position that may explain my motivation to avoid getting stuck in one of the extreme positions. I start with the hardcore instrumentalist. If we analyze all sorts of human-machine interactions that have harmful outcomes, we will be confronted with a special type that generates responsibility gaps, namely the cases where the human is excused for good reasons, and the artificial system is, according to the hardcore instrumentalist view, exempt in principle. If artificial systems are mere tools, then we can either question previously justified justifications for cases in which the tool using human or the tool creating human is excused, or we must live with a lot of responsibility gaps. Many human-machine interactions that come with a negative outcome would then amount to cases where we cannot attribute responsibility. Since we will be confronted with an increasing number of human-machine interactions that will have harmful outcomes, I think many of them could be of this very special type I just described, where the human participant is excused. And then it's not very attractive to handle all the responsibility gaps, and it's not attractive to sort of make all the excuses we developed for humans invalid on the other option. Furthermore, I do see difficulties in how we could argue for social norms guiding our behavior toward artificial systems if we claim that artificial systems have no moral patiency. But I think it's important that human society develop social norms, as the patterns of how we treat artificial systems will always carry the risk that we transfer those patterns to human interactions as well, especially because we can observe an increasing indistinguishability. Now I turn to the in-expectation of AGI view. In arguing for the in-expectation of AGI view, one would claim it is appropriate to consider certain artificial systems as moral patients or moral agents. I think this comes with the risk of prioritizing artificial agents over human beings. If we take this extreme position to its logical conclusion, this can lead to cases in which it seems morally imperative to behave towards artificial systems in a way that simultaneously question the dignity of humans. If we treat certain machines in the very same way as we treat our human fellows, we may need to decide whether we are ready to sacrifice humans for machines, or we need to find ways of dealing with solutions to potentially immoral actions of machines, because putting them into prisons is somehow senseless. The very question of whether we would sacrifice humans for machines and how we should deal with the artificial criminals shows that human societies are not prepared to incorporate new alien types of social moral agents into their existing social practices. Simply treating them in the very same way as human agents may lead to bizarre and questionable constellations. A conceivable counter movement, and that was somehow already topic of Eric's talk, could be that we would argue to create a second class of social agents, to which explicitly fewer rights are ascribed than to human social agents. However, I agree with Eric, of course, given the underlying thesis of this view that artificial agents qualify as moral agents and patients on the basis of comparable abilities and characteristics, this would not be a viable alternative, because that would mean that we would return to the ethically questionable practice of attributing the status of slaves to certain agents. Ascribing moral agency and patiency to certain artificial agents would require, in addition, clear criteria as to which artificial systems can qualify for the whole package we require from human moral agents. Looking at the debate about consciousness, I do not see any agreement that could lead to any criteria that would be usable by the general public. Because, I mean, it's not the question whether any sophisticated philosopher of the science of consciousness is able to formulate complicated criteria. It would also be an important question whether the normal human being on the street can sort of make the difference as well. Instead, I assume that the human tendency to anthropomorphize will be a crucial factor to consider if we would follow this in expectation of AGI view. That means for the general public, it will still not be clear which of the many artificial agents can be ascribed an ethical status. It is then conceivable that over-attributing would become more common in everyday life precisely because it's probably considered more tragic than under-attributing. At a first glance, it seems worse to falsely attribute no ethical status to an agent than not to attribute an ethical value to an agent who would deserve this. This opens up the possibility for engineers to create AI systems that can exploit human vulnerabilities in the interest of companies, because we do not know which of the many artificial systems are the ones which have sort of reached AGI. From my point of view, it is important that we elaborate on both the similarities and the differences at the same time, or as I frame it later, we should pay attention to the asymmetric feature of human-machine interactions. However, I will not focus further on the ethical implications in this talk, which nevertheless strongly motivate me to try to question the dichotomous conceptualizations we have in our frameworks. So now we go to the jungle. Concluding, I say that all this speaks for an approach that investigates the in-between area without categorizing the phenomena found there into one of the two categories. To prepare my proposal of how we can conceptualize the in-between, I repeat my claim that all entities that do not fulfill the necessary condition to fall into one of the two categories fall by the wayside. In other words, there are entities, at least I believe that possess a mixture of properties and capacities from both categories, and we don't even have terms to adequately describe them. I hope I succeed in motivating you to at least try to question the dichotomy between the innate tools and the social agents, between tool use and social interactions. Assuming that there are in-between phenomena that cannot be assigned to either category, entities that possess a mixture of properties and abilities from both categories, then we can only prevent them from falling by the wayside if we question the dichotomy, or what is still an alternative, and maybe somebody would rather go this way, or you could introduce a new category, but I'm not fond of that. Now I ask, what do we need to find our way through this jungle? I suggest that the toolkit of so-called minimal approaches can be very helpful here. These approaches have already shown how one can conceptualize phenomena in the field of developmental psychology and animal cognition that fall through the sophisticated conceptual net of philosophy. Minimal approaches address this problem by questioning the necessity of far too demanding conditions and therefore consider multiple realizations of capacities that seem to be restricted to sophisticated adult humans only. To name one, I refer to the notion of minimal mind reading introduced by Butterfield and Appelay. The integration of minimal notion presents an important step in expanding the rather restrictive standard terminology of philosophy. Only with additional new minimal notions, philosophical terminology can capture the diversity of phenomena for which we have empirical findings. With the help of minimal approaches, it can become possible to connect such empirical findings and our common sense with the theoretical work in philosophy. However, up to now, minimal approaches mostly opted for expanding notions describing the capacities of living beings, which means that, in the end, they did not explicitly question the dichotomy, which I want to question. I suggest that a similar move can be made when dealing with the status of artificial systems, and I want to resist the temptation to be guided by the dichotomy and develop a notion that is not restricted to the application to living beings. Starting from the observation that the hardcore instrumental view claims that artificial agents cannot participate in shared agency, while the in expectation of AGI view takes up the intuitive sense that some human-machine interactions are cases of genuine shared agency, I suggest that there is something like a middle ground between sub-intentional interactions that amount to mere behavior of machines and the intellectualists' views of shared agency we know from philosophy. The first step is to argue for the claim that there is no necessity to ask for an equal distribution of abilities among all participants of a joint action, for example. This can be illustrated by looking at phenomena explored by developmental psychology. There we find joint actions of adults and children. And nobody, I think, will deny that children are socially interacting beings. Those joint actions are asymmetric in the sense that children do not have to fulfill the demanding conditions adults have to fulfill. And I think in the same way, we may conceive certain human-machine interactions as asymmetric joint actions and claim that artificial systems are socially interacting entities while they play a role in this joint action. But of course, they don't have to fulfill the children conditions. This is a very frequent misunderstanding that people seem to believe that I think that artificial systems have to fulfill the conditions which children have to fulfill in asymmetric joint actions. It's just sort of transferring the idea that it can be asymmetric in several ways. And so we have a new list of conditions for the artificial systems, which we have to elaborate on. So I think, and I hope that Eric still thinks this as well, that there is a spectrum of asymmetric joint actions conceivable in which the junior partner is lifted or scaffolded into complex joint actions by the engagement and structuring of the more knowledgeable partner, the senior partner, who knows that they know what the other knows and fully appreciate the social structure of the interaction they are having. This spectrum may start with quasi-social artificial systems, as Eric and I have described in our paper, and goes gradually from sorta social to properly social cases. And now we look sort of at the humans as examples for showing this quasi-social interactions. Premature infants might respond to a soothing touch and sound without being ready for anything like a joint action, but showing some sort of sociality already. Or non-human animals might recognize, even though only in a minimal sense, that you are another entity with which it is interacting. For example, and this example came from Eric, but I like it very much, if you let a pet snake climb on you. A striking feature of human asymmetric sociality and asymmetric joint actions is that parents or the senior partners provide scaffolding for the child's developing sociality. By treating the child as a social partner, the parents help make the child a social partner. When we are slightly aspirational in our interpretations of our children, reading into their action and reaction, maybe a little bit more sophistication than there really is. This helps those children rise into their roles and attributes we imagine for them. By trusting, we help them make more trustworthy. By treating them as fair, moral, sympathetic to others, we help make them more fair, moral, and sympathetic to others. And now we could ask ourselves, is that true for artificial systems as well? Eventually, it could be true for artificial systems, but only for artificial systems which would be able to learn from our interaction with them. And that's why I would claim that at least the interactions I had with large language models do not fall into this category. Perhaps for the right machines, the machines who are able to learn from interactions. This could be true for AI systems as well, but I think it's only true for the systems which are able to learn from our interaction with them. And that's why I claim that at least the interactions I had with large language models do not fall in this category, because the large language model didn't learn from my specific interaction with it. But perhaps for the right machines, if we treat them as social partners, this can help them to develop the patterns of reactions that make them even more social. But we can describe many instances of interactions between a fully social agent and some partner, whether human, machine, or animal, that is not cognitively capable of full-fledged social joint action, but does respond in a way that productively invites further social responses from the social partner. So even though we may not have the hope that the artificial systems ever learn to be a social partner in a full-fledged joint action, we can sort of assume that maybe the first quasi-social instances can already be experienced. This is just sort of a sketch of on which conditions we might elaborate if we look for the conditions for the junior partner, in the sense that the AI system is the junior partner interacting with a human. And there we would have an asymmetric minimal joint action if the junior partner has minimal agency. So I still have to convince Josh that large language models have minimal agency. And then I would have to show that they have minimal coordination abilities. And there are a lot of things to be elaborated, whether they are able to anticipate what the other partner is doing, minimal mind reading, whether they have anything like a minimal sense of commitment, which seems to be critical for joint actions, or whether they even can sort of build a world model and share a world with us. And these are all open questions. And maybe next year I will have an elaborated account on that. But that doesn't matter. This would be sort of on the very right side of this spectrum. And we can sort of go back and look more on the left side of the spectrum. And my talk was something what really worries me. Because in the beginning with the whole thing, I had the hope that we can sort of at least hope for a solution in maybe 5 years or 10 years. And nowadays I'm quite convinced that there are good reasons to think that we will not solve this conceptualization problem, because we don't know when we are justified to ascribe certain abilities to artificial systems. So I think that the uncertainty regarding ascribing properties and abilities to artificial systems is founded on the fact that we are confronted with at least 3 moving targets. Namely, the first moving target is computer science research itself, because it's moving so quickly. And the debates about attributions do not seem to come to an agreement. What you see on the right side is a review about where NLP researchers were asked whether they would attribute something like understanding to large language models. And you can see it's 50-50. So it doesn't look like that the people will come to agreement. And there's a lot of papers showing that all the benchmark tasks are not really helpful for that, because they have a lot of problems, and we are not sure whether they are measuring what they tell us they would measure. Illustrating this, you can see the NLP research meta-survey and many papers about really different positions in the computer science community, what properties the systems have or not have. But we have a second moving target, and this is philosophy. The meaning of the notion we use for attributions of mental and social cognitive abilities seems to be under debate. And then so maybe some minimal versions of agency will be the standard in 2 weeks, or maybe in 2 years. And then so this is difficult, because if we have 2 moving targets, it's hard to sort of to decide how we can freeze them, at least in a moment. The third moving target I diagnose in our sociological processes and in the legal changes. they continuously contribute to a change of our social practice and of what status and rights are assigned to artificial counterparts. So, for example, in US, in certain counties, delivery bots have the right of pedestrians. And so this is changing day by day. And maybe philosophy is sort of trying to cover that as well. But if it's changing all the time, it's sort of a never-ending job. Therefore, there is not much hope that we will come to a scientifically sound and accepted ascription in the foreseeable future. This means that all I can hope for then is that there will be a process in between the computer science people, the philosophy people, sociological people, and the legal research. And this is why I'm working on a chapter in my book, which is called Inbetweenism, which I call a plea for cross-disciplinary collaboration. I think the next important topic is how can we handle this uncertainty? And at the same time work on collaborations where we can at least reduce the uncertainty a little bit. But we need more people than just philosophers or just computer science people or just ethical people. We need at least 5, 6 different disciplines. And this is a very difficult story because normally disciplines are not very good to talk to each other. I conclude that I hope that my talk could at least motivate you to consider the possibility of questioning the dichotomy between the animate and inanimate entities, even though you might still ask yourself why one should change a winning team. I would argue that we are confronted with a new game, but I can't offer you an easy solution. Things will get more complicated. The main aim of this talk was just to prepare the grounds for questioning the dichotomy between the animate and inanimate entities. And this is, according to my view, an important presupposition for developing a good conceptual framework that can capture phenomena that I locate in the in-between. If I am successful with this, in the maybe next 10 or 20 years, I can argue for a gradual approach, describing all kinds of interactions and finally answer the question of what are we doing when we interact with a large language model? What status artificial systems may have in human-machine interactions. Then we can stop reducing all our interactions with artificial systems and especially with future products of generative AI to mere tool use. And all those considerations would not have come to my mind if I would not have the great possibility to interact with people and machines. That's why I thank all my collaborators and especially all the authors to the anthology which I published this year, like Eric, like Sven, and like Syed, and like Josh. So this is a personal thank you to you.
Great. Thank you for that, Anna. Thank you for that talk.
Thanks a lot, Anna. Thanks also for editing the book from my side. Now, so my question is going to be a kind of a version of the question that I asked Josh before about agents and agency. And so you talk about large language models, you said at the beginning. So I wonder where the agent is, so to speak. So let's say that I'm running a large language model on my computer or my phone. One option would be to say that as long as I'm doing that, my laptop is an agent or my smartphone is an agent. Another option, I guess, would be no, it's not. It's somehow related to the agent here, the minimal agent, but the agent is the large language model itself or something like that. Or what? So what is your take on that? Like where's the agent? Where is it located? Him or her? Them, it.
This is really a nice question. And I would say first you have to follow me making the difference between individual agency and joint agency. So all I'm describing are interactions. And I'm not saying that there are systems which can individually act. And I think even in the human case, I'm quite convinced that we first socially interact before we are really properly able to have individual agency. And then so it's a different kind of agent. we are looking for. We are not looking for an agent which could sort of decide to go somewhere else. We are looking for an agent who is involved in an interaction. And then so the large language model, as long as I'm not interacting with it, is not an agent. But by sort of interacting with the large language model, I give the large language model something like joint agency. And then, of course, the entity consisting of, I don't know, software, data, and electronic, and whatever is in there, is a kind of an agent, but only under certain circumstances. So an unprompted large language model does not have individual agency, but a prompted large language model would have joint agency because it's able to sort of go back forward, back forward. Does that help?
Yeah, unprompted large language models. It sounds a little bit sad, like it's just sitting there doing it. Anyway, but yeah, thanks a lot.
Thanks, Anna. I always like listening to your talks. I'm going to ask you about something that you and I have talked about, and I'm kind of curious to see if you've changed your view or what. You know that so you've articulated this in-betweenist view, and then one of the things I kind of worry about is what counts as the extreme in between which you want to locate your view. There's something like maybe shifting goalposts, right? So sometimes it's between the animate and the inanimate. Sometimes it's between tools and agents. But of course, these aren't quite the same because there's inanimate things like rocks that aren't tools. And then even when it comes to the animate, you make a distinction between moral patients and moral agents. And so by the time you put all these extreme positions, they're not the same. And by the time you put them together, it looks like you actually have like a fairly, sophisticated, graduated, spectrum of possibilities. So what, why can't we just keep doing what it seems like you're already doing and add positions in between? What does in-betweenism add to carving out spaces of these kinds?
So the three advantages why I'm trying to advocate in-betweenism is first that we don't have to attribute the full package we learn from philosophy. We have to attribute to make somebody a moral agent or a moral patient or an agent or a joint action partner or whatever. So the one advantage is that we have a reason not to attribute the whole package from the right side. And the second reason or advantage for going my way, at least I hope so, is that we can learn to understand that the dichotomy in between the inanimate and animate has consequences. So if you follow this dichotomy, you sort of, you can't get out of it. And the one consequence is that you have the social interactions only with living beings. And the other consequence is that tools tend to be dead. And of course, we have this exceptions, and we discussed this, and I'm still not sure how to convince you. Of course, I can use you as a tool.
Yeah.
Something. But this is not the question I'm asking. The question I'm asking is, if I only have two boxes where I can put things in, I look at them and look what properties they have, and either they fit in the living box or they fit in the non-living box. Then I will have entities which have some properties of the one box entry stuff and some properties of the others. And where do you put them? And then so maybe this was a little step into convincing you a little bit more.
Thanks, Anna.
Thanks, Anna. I continue to agree with everything that you said in that talk, just to confirm. Completely convincing and true, and everyone should subscribe to the entirety. All right, so I was thinking about the patiency side. So you talk about the in-between agency, and I was thinking, there's a type of view on which it's really simple on the patiency side, classical utilitarianism, right? So you just say, okay, well, look, how much pleasure or suffering is this entity capable of? And we just somehow tote that up, and then we have the degree of patiency that corresponds to its degree of capacity for suffering. So it ends up being a simple unidimensional spectrum. And I was wondering what your thoughts are about that possible solution on the patiency side.
I mean, of course, I hate utilitarianism in general for several reasons. But I think if you sort of elaborate on the examples we can see with the fighting for rights for nature things, where rivers and mountains and lakes get the right not to be polluted, there you don't need the suffering anymore. So nobody has to say that the river is suffering and has pain or is more happy if he's not polluted. And then so maybe there is a possible theory of saying patiency or the attribution of rights does not have to be grounded on capacities like having pleasure or pain. I don't know. What do you think?
So I think, one thing that I've seen kind of more utilitarian oriented philosophers say is, okay, well, look, there's legal personhood, which we ascribe to corporations already, and maybe you could ascribe to rivers too. And but that's different from moral personhood or moral patiency, and that legal personhood or patiency is justified just derivatively on the benefits that accrue to entities that are actually intrinsically moral patients.
Yeah, and then you separate sort of, you have patiency by birth or you get patiency by some nice humans.
Right, and that the second would always be kind of a fiction. Yeah.
But then we would not be able to enlarge our ethical club, are we?
Oh, well, I mean, I don't want to linger on this too much, but of course, a lot of people in this group think that non-human animals, are capable of large amounts of suffering. So the group isn't enlarged, except that we need to recognize who is already in it, which includes people and patients that we might not previously have recognized. Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
From Lawrence Whitney. Lawrence asks, I wonder whether, and if so, how, you see your model functioning with respect to neural implants. What happens to agency when humans and machines are merged?
Did that happen already?
Suppose, yeah, Elon Musk is working on something called Neuralink, which I think is one small case of it perhaps working, but not clear. But it's on the horizon, I imagine.
I was going to say, I think there are cases they've tested on some people or something like that.
I have to think about that question. I can't answer this spontaneously. I don't want to merge with a machine, so.
Well, okay, so this is a follow-up to my previous question about where's the agent and how to think about that. So so you offer one view, so the agent or the agency comes into being when you interact with you prompt the language model, and so there's a kind of joint agency. Why take that view rather than the view that would be some version of the sort of the extended mind thesis that you yourself are exercising a new kind of agency when you're using this technology. You become so I know that Chalmers, talks about that and is skeptical because I think that he thinks it's too independent and so on. But why would we take your view rather than some version of an extended mind or extended agency view that is actually just you're the agent, and now you can exercise a new kind of agency that is a little bit unusual because it involves the large language model. So why do you need the minimal other agent that comes into being when you start prompting it?
I hope that I understand David Chalmers rightly in that he is claiming at the moment that looking at large language models, it's more like distributed cognition and not like extended mind. And this has to do with the autonomy. So a large language model is not sort of under my control. And if I would be Otto and had my notebook, it would be under my control what I put in the notebook. And if it's distributed cognition, then the large language model has agentive properties and a little bit of autonomy and does different things which I do not control. I could be an expert, I could anticipate a lot. Maybe I'm able to manipulate large language models because I know what a trigger word could be, or because I have a lot of prompt engineering experience, but still it would be another. And an extended mind would not be my way because it's sort of taking the large language model into my mind.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sympathetic to not saying that you're extending your mind. I just think that given that your view is that the agent doesn't exist unless you're using the agent, so to speak, in a certain sense, if you're like, if Lordy, you're thinking, it's an agent, it doesn't have intelligence. I guess he thinks that it's there all the time, and then it's only exercises agency when someone prompts it, but it's an agent, so to speak, all along. And then, but given that your view is that it's not an agent, I think, unless you prompt it, I could see how someone might think that would push you in the direction of some version of it, some sort of like it's only your agency there, and it's just anyway, I mean, we shouldn't have too many backs and forth, but it seems to me like another possible view, and I mean, I think.
But maybe you're still following the dichotomy, being an agent or not being an agent. And it could be possible that in certain circumstances, an entity is not an agent, and in other circumstances, it is an agent.
Well,
And
you
then
might have fallen back on this suggestion that I had before, that it could be sort of some sort of agency without an agent, whatever that might mean.
So there is this indigenous worldview anecdote that as long as you're playing with something, it is an agent and you have to behave nicely. And as soon as it's standing in the corner, it's not anymore. It's not animate anymore. So it becomes animate through the relational turn, through having an interaction.
Yeah, well, I mean, I do have some sympathy to that idea that you should be nice to it. So anyway, but yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.
So I'm wondering what you think. So there's this paper by Andrew Lee, I think it says forthcoming in news, where I think you can have a dichotomy, but still have a degree of agency. So one example that he gives is like it's a matter of degree whether something, or sorry, it's not a matter of degree whether something has mass or not. Either you have mass or you don't. But then mass comes in degrees. So the dichotomy is still there. It's just that when you have agency, agency itself can come in degrees. So that's kind of like the paper that I wrote for your anthology, that it could be not only agency is a matter of degree, but it's also multiple dimensions, like not just one or two, like several dimensions. And then each one of those dimensions comes in degrees. But whether you belong into that matrix or not, that still is a dichotomy.
Yeah, I mean, of course. I mean, if our notions would not have any boundaries, then we could not use them to describe anything. So there must be something what is not applicable. But I'm not saying that there are no dichotomies at all. I just say that our leading, guiding dichotomy to separate, especially in the ethical discourse, animate things from inanimate things, forces us to positions which are not very attractive. And maybe if we sort of just try what's happening with our conceptual framework, if we get rid of this dichotomy, we can have a more fine-grained language about certain human-machine interactions, and then we can sort of better clarify questions of distributed responsibility and stuff like that. So I'm not saying that everything is somehow potentially acting. Of course, there are non-acting, non-agentive entities in our world.